Hello, my name is Ibsha,
My name's Raf.
and we are Murder at the Round Table, a podcast where we talk about true crime and murder mostly. I don't think we've talked about any other topics, have we?
No, the most sensational is murder, so that's our go-to.
Yes,
It's where the tea is.
that's where all the tea is. So if you don't like murder, I suggest you can log off or check out. But if that is
Damn, we're already
yeah.
kicking people off right when we
I
start.
guess. But if you do enjoy the topics of true crime, be sure to subscribe, download, and give us a 5-star review. We are on Spotify and Amazon Podcast now. So please do support us there. And you can also follow us on Instagram, where we post pretty much pictures or maps or anything that you might need in order to understand this episode a little bit better. Okay, so I didn't plan a pre segment because my research is pretty long, but you're welcome to share anything with the group today. Anything you've been up to or anything?
Honestly, not too much to say. Like we got the whole, weather situation where we're at, but that's pretty typical.
Speaking of the weather,
Yeah.
so the last episode that I actually listened to was the Copenhagen
hmm
murders, I think it was. And we were talking about the weather on that one, and we said we'd mention a little bit, whether it be about the weather or anything that would give hints to people about where we live.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I think I have a big one in our episode today, so I'll wait. But if you wanted to give a hint right now, you're welcome to do so.
Honestly, weather hints, I'm not really sure that this will do much other than, especially like the last week, we've had like the days where we start off with just snowfall and it's really cold and it's like, oh, winter's back. And then by the end of the day, everything's melted, we're back to summer. And it's like, okay, I don't know where the hell I live.
I was talking
hmm
to someone not too long ago, and they said with global warming, we might not actually have seasons. So nature's going to throw whatever it wants whenever it wants. And I told that to my dad, and my dad's like, that can't happen because I got a garden to maintain.
Yeah, man's is gonna have to get a greenhouse at that point.
Pretty much, I think we're gonna have to invest in a greenhouse. Our house is pretty much a greenhouse all the time. We have large plants growing throughout the year, and these plants are generally like vegetables, so we also eat them throughout the year. So
hmm
I think our house is going to be a large greenhouse soon.
Yeah, I'd be down for a greenhouse actually, like connected to like a sunroom or something in your backyard.
I think it would be pretty cool. If that's going to happen in the next, let's say, 20, 30 years, I feel like the housing, the ways houses look, are going to change. If
hmm
we're going to have a sunroom or a greenhouse attached to every house, it's going to be bigger. It's going to look very different.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, good chat. Good pre-second. So I'm wondering if you've heard this one. I'm actually moving away from Nahani for just this episode. I might go back to Nahani the next one, but this one's called the Black Donnelly Massacre. Have you heard of this one?
No, for a second there, I thought you said Black Dahlia.
No. Black Donnelly Massacre.
Okay.
The reason why I kind of was wondering if you knew it, because there's actually a museum and brewery somewhere in Western Ontario, but this is where
hmm
massacre occurred in southwestern Ontario in a place called Badolph Township. The timeline is anywhere from the 1840s to the 1880s. My sources are ghostwalks.com, the donnellymuseum.com, canadianmysteries.ca,
Okay.
mysteryquest.ca, citizens.on.ca, aaronheller.com, and I think I listened to a podcast and it's called Cold Case, but if that's wrong, whatever podcast I listen to will be linked in the description below. A couple of the trigger warnings are there's murder, of course, violence, and brief mention of animal cruelty, but I don't get too deeply into that because it's not that important or relevant, but it's mentioned.
Wow, you saying animal cruelty is not an important and relevant subject?
To this case,
Fam is just canceling herself at this point. But okay, keep going.
pretty much cancel me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a brief description of what this case is,
hmm
and then we're going to go time traveling into the past, talk about some history, then come back to the 1840s, and we'll go through the entire case. Does that sound good?
Yeah, so I guess I'll keep track of notes. I need to build a timeline here.
I would definitely recommend building notes because there's a lot of names in this.
Okay.
So, yeah, definitely keep notes. So, a quote from the Mystery Quest states early morning of February 4th, 1880, five members of an Irish immigrant family were murdered in Western Ontario, allegedly by an armed band of vigilantes from the community. Although this case did go to trial, no one was ever convicted of committing these crimes. There was also two eyewitnesses. Any thoughts?
Okay, so they know the family was killed. They know the group essentially that did it. This went to trial. Why was nobody convicted? Like, were they cops?
So we'll figure out why and what happened,
Hmm.
obviously. But that was kind of like my biggest questions. Like, essentially, you do have eyewitnesses, and it did go to trial. So for me, this is why this story kind of stood out. Like, why is it unsolved? That's kind of like the rabbit hole that I went down.
Okay.
That was the biggest questions, and that's why I did a deep dive into this matter. So Biddulph this time had conflicts, and there was high rate of crimes, violence, and people generally hated each other.
Why was there such a high rate though?
We'll get to that. Basically, there was high rates of crimes and violence in the area, and that's what led to the Donnelly family being massacred. So the crimes equals the massacre. Historians have looked into this, and they have some guesses. So this is where I'm going to go back in history in Ireland, and then we'll come back. So history starts with the religious hatred with Oliver Cromwell, who took over Ireland. He wanted to settle wealthy English Protestants to basically create a community of wealthy, powerful Protestant landlords. So what this meant was that the Irish people, Irish Catholics, they were pretty much farming on English people's land, but this was in Ireland, so technically Irish people's land.
There's a movie called Belfast that talks about actually this situation.
There was a few problems with the settlement. First of all, rent was extremely high, and the Irish people who were living here, they were essentially super poor. And then the English landlords who owned the land, they actually didn't live on this land, and this practice would later be carried over to Canada. But in Ireland, this meant that the English landlords, they didn't maintain or care for the land. Neither did they care or check in with the farmers that looked over the land. Also, the Irish people were denied receiving any rights to the land that they worked on, so they didn't have any ownership rights. Around the 1750s, the Irish Catholics, they created a secret society. They were called the White Boys.
Okay.
They had an oath. So the oath was to get revenge on the English Protestants and to not have any contact with the Protestants. This includes talking to them, trading with them, or even working with them. That was the oath. As time went on, the White Boys went into serious terrorizing, and so they were terrorizing the Protestants, and any Catholics that would associate with the Protestants, they would pretty much also be terrorized as well. Some of the things that the White Boys did was kill livestock, burn down houses, and even commit murder. There was also an opposing group. Do you want to take a guess at what their name is?
Well, we have the white boys, so do we have the black boys?
Close. Okay. This is
Oh my God.
So this is a Catholic group who associated with the Protestant and objected to the violence of the White Boys. And in Biddulph Township, so in Canada, they were known as the Blackfeet.
Okay.
That's where the Black and Black Donnelly comes from. When I first read about this case, I was like, why are they called Black Donnellys? Is it because the massacre, essentially they were burnt? Their house was burnt down, so I thought that. This conflict that was in Ireland, it essentially did carry over with the immigrants that were moving to Canada. So during the time where the Donnellys lived in Biddulph, there was equal amount of white boys and Blackfeet. So that answers your question you had at the beginning. Why was there so much crime and hatred and violence? It's because you had equal amounts of opposing groups available in Biddulph Township.
Okay, okay.
Historians also had two other theories, and this is mostly the theories within the Canadian border to why there was conflict that led to the massacre. First, it was lawlessness. The white boys created their own laws and took decisions into their own hands. This included convicting
Mm-hmm.
and sentencing anyone that didn't listen to them. So there were pretty much the vigilant committees. Number two was conflict over land. The people that were coming into Canada during the 19th century were people who were not able to own land in their native
Okay.
country. So essentially, the Irish people that were farming in Ireland and didn't own any property because of the English people, they came to Canada to see what can happen. But in one of the sources, it says these people started coming to Canada because they're, a quote, had plenty of land to give, end quote. Canada during this time of people coming in did have land laws, but these laws actually differed based on like who was purchasing the land. So the law wasn't like equally distributed amongst the people. And historians believe that the crime and violence in Biddulph was related to the questionable practices of purchasing and owning land. That was pretty much the history portion of this. And before we start the story, do you have any questions, comments? Does this make sense?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. You see that a lot, like when you have a conflict in origin country, and then you have people from both groups who, immigrate to somewhere else, and then now that starts, a conflict at the new
Yeah.
location, essentially. I have always heard that it is interesting when it comes to Canada, though, because you may hate the person who came with you because they're from like a different group, but winter equalizes all.
Pretty much.
Like you can be all as mad as you want, but you both will have to shovel snow and scrape
Yeah.
ice off of your cars.
Yeah. I was gonna say in this case, we don't see that, unfortunately.
Well, for some cases, not all cases, but for some cases you end up just finding peace.
Yeah. So I'm going to start the main story. So we're back maybe a little before 1840s. Our story starts in Ireland with our main guy, James Donnelly Sr. Junior Donnelly, James Donnelly comes up pretty soon, so I'm just gonna from here on out call James
Okay.
Donnelly Sr. He was a coach driver and he soon meets Johanna McGee. They fall in love, but Johanna's father does not approve of their union, so they elope.
Oh,
Everything from here, I'm gonna say this right now, is a little bit unclear. And every source that I have read, every article or whatever, there's different facts about what happened. I think with my research here on, I've picked out the most common things that occurred throughout this timeline between 1840 to 1880 and a little bit after. So the events that popped up the most, essentially there are smaller things that happened between each event that some sources talk about. I'm probably going to mention some of them, but I just picked out the main events.
okay. So picked out the main events from the moment like they elope to the moment the family dies.
Pretty much the main events. So I probably am missing a lot of things, but again, every single source that I have read has
Hmm.
something different to say about these people and what happened.
Okay. Sounds good.
So, sometime in 1841, Johanna gave birth to hers and James Sr.'s first son, which was James Donnelly Jr. James Donnelly Jr., I feel like the first time I read this case, he had a more important role in this story, but
Hmm.
he doesn't come up a lot in my research. However, I remember the podcast that I listened to did mention that he was crippled. Either he had an injury on his leg that he got as a child, or he was born with a deformity on his leg.
Okay.
I'm not sure which one. Between the years 1842 and 1846, the three arrived in Canada and moved to Biddulph Township.
Hmm.
However, some sources say that James Sr. actually came to Canada alone in 1842, and Johanna and James Jr. came later. Regardless, they arrived in Canada onto a land that was originally owned by a man named John Grace. Again, he was an absent landlord. The practices that was carried over from Ireland to Canada. There's actually no clarity of how Donnelly got this land. Few sources say that James Sr. made prior arrangements with Grace to be able able to work and live on this land. However, my understanding was that there's no written contract stating that Donnelly can live and work on the land. If there is any arrangements or agreements between Grace and Donnelly, it was all verbal and nothing was in written. So we don't have any contracts or anything like that.
Yep, handshake promises.
Pretty
But
much.
you got to be wary of those. Yeah, if you've ever seen The Founder, that movie is a pretty big one for that.
On the flip side, sources also state that the Donnellys were squatters, so people who essentially take over land that has been abandoned without having legal documents or ownerships. So that's essentially what the Donnellys did. They found abandoned land, nobody owned it, and they kind of just took over it and started working on it. I have a side note that says squatters are protected by law in Canada. Formerly, it was known as the adverse possessions right, and every province and territory has different policies. In our province, the adverse possession rights, it was abandoned very recently in 2022. So nobody can come into our homes, live there, and being like, this is our land. It's been abandoned, it's illegal, we can call the police, and things will be taken care of.
Wait, is this something that's unique to our province?
This is unique to our province. Every province is a little bit different.
Okay, remember that thing you were saying earlier about giving hints?
Yeah.
We just dead up straight said where we were.
I don't know. I haven't looked into this. I was wondering if you wanted to, in a different episode, explore squatter rights, because when I was telling a friend about this, there was a lot of things that came up in our conversation. For example, the next part, I say that Ontario, the adverse possessions right, it's still a thing there. It's still something that exists. So essentially, if somebody lives on a piece of land for 10 years, or in a house for 10 years without paying rent, they can technically say that this house is mine. There's more policies, of course. They can't simply do that. But there was a lot of questions that I had, and I'm assuming that back in the 1800s when the Donnellys took over, there was squatter rights or adverse possession rights. That's why they were able to do so. Essentially, I'm saying other provinces, I don't know what their rules are. I just looked at our province and Ontario because that's where this took place. If you are able to figure out which province from just that, I would be very impressed.
I wouldn't. I don't want to get doxxed, fam.
I don't think so.
Y'all can speculate as much as you want, but don't show up at my front door. But okay, so squatters' rights. Now, question for you on this point. The land that we're saying they're squatting on, that's not the one that's owned by John Grace.
It is, yeah.
It is. Oh, okay. So we don't know if it was because of squatting rights that they got the land or if it was a handshake deal with John Grace.
Yeah, we essentially don't know.
Okay.
So the Donnellys took over the land because the owner was absent and they started to cut down the trees, build a farm, and they actually grew a family for the next 10 years. In those 10 years, there was more Donnelly children. You might want to write down their names.
Okay. Who we got?
We got James Jr., who was born in 1841.
So this is the eldest?
Yeah, this is the eldest, the one who has the issue with the leg.
Okay.
Okay, up next is William Donnelly. He was born in 1845. John Donnelly, 1847. Patrick Donnelly, 1849.
Damn, all sons. Okay.
Michael Donnelly, 1851. Robert Donnelly, 1853. Thomas Donnelly, 1854.
Okay.
And last, we have Jane Donnelly, 1857, and I think she was also referred to as Jenny. She's not mentioned a lot. One sources say that she was married pretty young and then she passed away in 1912, but that's all we know about her. So I'm not sure what the conflict and the violence situation was during this time. I'm assuming that there was, because obviously we have the equal amount of white boys and the equal amount of black feet in this community, so there was violence. But the main conflict started somewhere between 1856 to 1857 when a man named Patrick Farrell purchased the land that the Donnellys were living on from John Grace, the absent landlord. So now we have actual legal papers that say that Patrick Farrell owns this property. But when he arrived to Canada from Ireland, he was surprised to see that people were already farming on it. He confronted James Sr., telling him to get off the land. However, James was not having any of that, and he pretty much beat Farrell's ass up. And while he was doing that, his family was cheering him on.
Yeah, that's not the best way to deal with a legal dispute.
No. So it's also been reported that James Sr. was actually a very
Hmm.
much smaller man in size compared to Farrell, but still was able to beat him up. Farrell took the matters to court, and the judge decided to divide the land up 50-50 between both parties. And again, I'm not sure if it's due to the squatters' law existing. The justice pretty much decided this because the land did legally belong to Farrell. However, it was James Sr. and Johanna that were actually working on that land. They took this pretty much abandoned forest land and worked on it to the point where it's a legit thriving farmland now. So that was pretty much the compromise and the agreement that yes, you do own it, but yes, these people have been putting in their efforts into this land.
Yeah, makes sense.
After that, neither sides were pretty much happy with that decision.
So I find it interesting that the approach of going back to requesting John Grace to give the money back to this guy so he can go purchase other land. But then at the same time, it is technically your land, but you should lose. If you're not paying attention to it and you're not involved with it at all, like, yeah, it shouldn't really belong to you anymore. It's kind of confusing.
Of course, like obviously you paid so much money to own this property, but then people have also been putting in so much effort and money into it as well.
Hmm.
Technically, Farrell did have the legal documentations. That's his land. But so did John Grace. Like, if we forget about Patrick Farrell for a second, if John Grace came back to his land and saying, hey, I want to live here I'm retired, I want to live here for the rest of my life, he still has to deal with these squatters, or essentially people that has been living on his land for over 10 years. So then what? He has the legal documents. It's his land, but now he's dealing with that. There's so many things that come up.
It gets confusing once you actually develop the land.
Exactly.
Like if they had been living there and didn't like really touch it or make any improvements, then it's pretty clear cut. But the second they've actually developed it, and I don't know what law it's part of or what it's written under, but like I do remember seeing something about like I guess development rights essentially. Like if you come into an abandoned piece of land and you make the changes, assuming that it's not government land or like protected land or something, it gets dicey on who owns it.
I think that's essentially what Ontario has. So if somebody moves into a house that is abandoned and they've lived here, again, if it's not like owned by the government or some restricted property, if they lived there for 10 years and they've been, working on the land like the Donnellys have, they created a farmland out of nothing, then they can stay. Essentially, they don't pay the mortgage, but that's their land too. And that was another thing. It's like, well, if I'm paying mortgage to this land, why should I have other people living there for rent free,
If you're paying mortgage for the land, then you wouldn't be the owner, you'd be leasing the land. Or like you'd be the leasee, I guess.
I
If
guess.
you're owning, yeah, this is a whole separate conversation in of itself.
Yeah, and I guess we can have a different episode to talk
Hmm.
about these things and even like go down the different provinces and what their rights are in terms of the adverse property rights in Canada.
Also, small side note, I think it's really cool to think about the fact that this is Ontario we're talking about because that's where there and Quebec is where you have like the first colonies. So a lot of the law that you might see now, you could technically say is like based on trying to deal with like people immigrating back then. So it's a cool little thing.
So, onto this story, I have in 1857 at a barn raising bee. I thought this was a pub at first, but it's actually a community of people who
Mhm.
gather to build a framework of a barn and then celebrate it. There's also drinking and other stuff happening while this barn raising bee thing is going on. Farrell and Donnelly got into a fight over their dispute, and it was pretty bloody. It ended up with Donnelly actually killing Farrell. James Donnelly Sr. actually fled the scene into the wilderness. However, However, soon people had noticed that there was a strange woman in a bonnet working on the Donnelly farm. It was later found that the strange woman was in fact James Donnelly Sr., who decided to disguise himself in his wife's clothes so he could continue working the fields.
An interesting sight.
Yeah, while being on the run, James Sr. was working on his friend's farm during the day. And once winter came around, he actually turned himself into the authorities. So you were right about winter playing a role in Canada. So he turned himself in the winter. James Donnelly Sr. was sentenced to hang by the court. However, Johanna went out with a petition to get a lesser sentence. She was successful, and James Sr. was sentenced to 7 years in penitentiary by the Attorney General, and the Attorney General at that time was John A. Macdonald. Donnelly would serve his sentence in the Kingston Penitentiary.
Oh, as in the John A. Macdonald?
The John A. Macdonald. I think if it was anybody else, the source would be like, it wasn't John A. Macdonald, it was someone else with the same name, but they didn't say that, so I'm assuming it was the John A. Macdonald. During this 7-year period, the rest of the family had very little income. Johanna, of course, has young children to look over, so she wasn't able to work, and the older children, they were too young to be working, and then they also required schooling. In 1861, Johanna donated a small portion of land to build a school. This is where the Donnelly children would go to school and get a proper education. Also, Johanna had a contract to clean and cater events at the school, allowing her to get some income. However, Johanna was not giving her children just good education. She was also giving them lessons to be fighters, and literal fighters. So Johanna taught the boys to hit first, talk later, and boys actually did take this lesson to heart. They were also seeing what happened with their father, so they actually listened. Later, they were known throughout the township as fighters, and later gained the reputation as thieves and vandals too. There were a lot of tools and supplies that were going missing in the neighborhood on a regular basis. Rival barns would be burnt down, cattle being poisoned, and farm animals being mutilated. Then, as I said, Biddulph Township was an extreme violent place, but the violence pretty much went up a notch. It wasn't that the Donnelly children were committing all these crimes on their own. Of course, there was other groups, but they generally had the reputation of being the toughest family, and they were the ones always being blamed because there's a lot of them. The BlackDonnelly.com states that not very many people were brave enough to confront the Donnelly family. At one time, someone actually did, because his tools were stolen, and the very next day, his house and barn was lit on fire, and his farm animals were mutilated or poisoned. So when James Donnelly Sr. returned to his family, he realized that his boys, they were not little anymore, they were little gangsters, or big gangsters at this point, and he returned in 1865. The next events are kind of like the ones, its and bits that I found things that were in common, so I'm going to take a little bit of time to read them and before telling you the story. So around 1870, some of the older Donnelly boys started to settle down and have their own families, and in one source, I believe it said that William Donnelly actually kidnapped his wife, and I don't know if it was from an opposing group, but the community essentially wasn't happy about that, and that also created more conflicts and violence. And in 1873, William and 3 of his brothers, Michael, John, and Tom, started their own stagecoach business, which would run between various areas in Lucian, where the Biddulph Township was. Business was good because the stagecoach idea, it was great to get around the Lucian area, that like I said. However, more stagecoach companies were popping up. One was the Flanagan Company, which was Donnelly's main rival, and it was run by Patrick Flanagan. Other companies actually sold their stage businesses to Flanagan, I think because there actually was kind of like a highway being built around this time. It was either a railway or a highway being built, which was much more accessible and
Hmm.
more used than a stagecoach was. So a lot of other companies were selling them to Flanagan. This obviously caused more feuds and probably one of the worst feuds between the Donnellys and the Flanagans. As always, things were violent. A lot of arsons were happening. A lot of animals were being killed. The Black Donnellys website shared that one night somebody actually snuck into Flanagan's barn. They sawed up the whole property, essentially breaking everything apart. They also attacked the horses. And of course, when Mr. Flanagan woke up the next morning, he came into his business being an entire wreck. So he actually put together a lynch mob and showed up to the Donnellys' barn. However, when they got to the barn, they were met with James Sr. and the rest of the Donnelly boys with clubs. Flanagan would be outnumbered and beaten. So Flanagan and his lynch mob, essentially, they were beaten pretty badly by the Donnellys. I don't know if anyone died, but the description said that they were broken and bloody on the ground. This is a little side note because she just shows up in 1878. Her name is Bridget Donnelly. I think she's the niece of James Donnelly Sr. She just came to visit her uncle and aunt, but she was one of the people that were a victim in the massacre. I'll say more about her later. In 1879, the town basically they appointed a new priest of St. Patrick Roman Catholic Church. He arrived in Biddulph and his name was Father John Connolly. It was believed that he could help stop the violence in the township, but we'll find more about whether he does or does not later.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's pretty much building up who the Donnellys were. Do you want to add anything to thoughts or questions or anything? Did you have an impression of who the Donnellys could be, and did that change throughout all this?
Well, first off, I'll say about the last question you had there, like, whether or not the Father John Connolly would come in and create peace. Considering it's 1879 and the murders we just talked about are 1880, I think no. The kids were just shit disturbers.
Essentially, yeah.
Also, it kind of is a little bit sus. So you know how there was our guy, Farrell, right? And so Farrell gets murked by Donnelly. Donnelly goes to prison. Did Farrell have family?
I don't think so, but it's fair to say that he was a white boy. He did have like a community and people of supporters. I don't know if he had family, wife or children. That was never mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I think. I'm not sure, but I assume because they fought.
Farrell was a white boy. Okay. Well, they probably fought more just about the land in general. Because I was thinking that it kind of came across like somebody was trying to set the Donnellys up. Because if it wasn't the Donnelly boys who were doing this whole like killing livestock and stuff, it's like somebody else wanting to turn like the community against them and then kick them out or something.
Yeah, so that was also the case. So somebody, a rival group, would actually do a crime
Mm-hmm.
and the blame would go on the Donnellys. So that did also happen.
Okay.
I'm not saying that they're innocent. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, it's a mix of both.
All right, well, tight knit and stuff. I feel like this family is very tight knit. I feel like this would have all been resolved though if, like, at some point Donnelly Sr. legally got the deed for the land or something, like within like the 10 years that he was there.
Again, things were lawless.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not even sure if that even crossed his mind. Because, again, the first time that we know that he was confronted, his go-to was to beat up the guy.
Yeah.
So essentially, like, maybe the deed thing to get a deed, it didn't happen. But again, law never applied to everyone equally. So maybe he did try and it just didn't work out to him because people were like, well, no, you're a Blackfeet. We can't do that.
No, I see what you mean.
I'm not saying like I'm supporting what is going on, but I'm just saying like I can see why that might have not been the case. But I'm wondering, did you have an impression when I first told you that 5 people were massacred? Did you have an impression of who the Donnellys were, and did that change?
Yes, because the way we started it is we said a family was murdered. So immediately that creates a image in your mind, right? That it was entirely innocent. But the more we find out of the family, it's just like when you keep pissing people off, everybody around you, and you're not building any alliances, shit happens.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just beating people up. At some point, something's gonna snap. Like,
Yeah.
You need a little bit of diplomacy.
Hmm.
The school that Joanna started, is that like still open or is it a historical site by any chance?
I'm not sure about the school, but
Okay.
I'm gonna say this later, but the property still exists. So the town hasn't changed that much.
Hmm.
I'm gonna get to this later, but I don't think much of the barn, the farm might have changed. Now there might be proper housing there. But yeah, a lot of it turned into a museum and kind of like a historical place. I'm not sure about the school. So we're at 1875. That's when the new priest was appointed. Now we're gonna go to 1880, February 3rd. We're gonna start at the night before when the massacre was starting to be planned by the vigilance committee.
Okay, I'm sorry, the father comes in 1875 or 79?
79, sorry. 79, the year before. I don't know if he was involved because obviously this hatred between the two groups have been happening for a while. So I don't know if he was called to the duty years before and just 1879 was the time he was like, yeah, I'm gonna
Hmm.
just walk over. So February 3rd, things were getting out of hand and a vigilance committee was formed. This vigilance committee was pretty much everyone that the Donnelly family were enemies with. Do you want to take a guess on who formed the committee?
Well, it's definitely Flanagan.
Well, the thing is, we don't know if he's alive or not.
Oh, then if it wasn't him. Oh, wait, it was a priest. What the hell? Mans comes in, man's a god, and is like, you know what the solution is? Just get rid of him. Yeah, that's, yeah.
Yep, it was the priest. Get rid of them. So I'm gonna tell you a few other names.
Uh-huh.
Essentially, these were the ringleaders, but these were also the people that
Uh-huh.
went into trial. This is six out of the many possible peoples
Okay.
that could have been. So Thomas Ryder, James Carroll, John Purtell, Martin McLaughlin, John Kennedy, and James Ryder. So these six and the priest, they were kind of like the main people that were part of this vigilance committee. And again, there were like a lot more people. We just don't know their names.
Oh, I see.
So the night of the massacre, the committee was drinking and working up a plan. They were gathering their weapons and they would eventually walk down to the Donnelly family and put them to the end. On the other side, that day, James Donnelly actually wrote a letter to his lawyer. I think somebody may have blamed the Donnelly boys on committing some sort of crime. However, that person realized that the Donnelly boys and the children, to be honest, were at a wedding. So the blame was actually put on James Sr. and Johanna.
Mm-hmm.
James Sr. was writing his letter to the lawyer saying that to have bail ready. On February 4th, the morning they were going to go to court and deal with that whole thing. So he sent out that letter, and on his way, he picked up a farmhand. The name of the farmhand was Johnny O'Connor. Now, in some sources, they say that Johnny O'Connor may have been a friend of the youngest Donnelly boy, Thomas, but some sources say that he was actually
Mm-hmm.
just a farmhand. Regardless, James Sr. actually had a lot of respect for this kid and took good care of him while he was working on the land. They had dinner together. James Sr. actually gave Johnny the main bedroom, the master bedroom, to sleep in for that night. I don't know exactly who he is, but
Okay.
James Sr. actually really cared for this boy. So he got picked up, and then John Donnelly, who was one of the boys who worked on the stagecoach business, he went over to William Donnelly's house, which was on Wayland Corner. I think it's like 3 kilometers from where the Donnelly family house was.
Interesting.
I'm not exactly sure. I said I don't know where James Donnelly was. Again, I'm pretty sure like he was around during that time, but not sure where he was during the night of. But a lot of the kids were not in the house.
Yep.
In the house, we have Johnny, who's the farmhand or the friend. He's sleeping in the main bedroom. We have Johanna, James Sr., and Bridget, and they were in a room together. And
Mm-hmm.
Tom was sleeping in another bedroom. I think it was Tom and James Sr. in one bedroom, Johnny in the main bedroom, and Johanna, Bridget in another bedroom. That makes more sense to me with the events that happened, but we'll see.
Okay.
So the next is from the website Ghost Walk, and
Mm-hmm.
I decided to just again, pick up the most common its and bits from that. So the vigilant committee went over to the Donnelly's home late that night. So the family was sleeping, they were shouting, and it woke up Johnny, the farmhand, who actually went to the window to see what was happening. He saw the mob coming towards the door, so he kind of hid under the bed. Again, he's in the master bedroom that was normally used by Johanna and James Sr. But they're sleeping in a different bedroom, and Johnny's under the bed. So the men from the vigilance quickly broke into the house and went to the first bedroom, and it happened to be Thomas's bedroom, and they put him in handcuffs. So I think they might have just handcuffed him to the bed because he was still asleep. And the person who put him into the handcuffs was James Carroll, who was a constable at this time in the community. So they put Thomas in a handcuffs. The mob went into the main bedroom to look for James Sr., but the room was empty since James Sr. wasn't in the bedroom and Johnny happened to be under the bed, but they didn't think that a grown adult would be under the bed, so they didn't check under the bed, so they didn't see Johnny.
Oh man, this kid is screwed.
Hiding. So James Sr., I guess, heard something and he went into Thomas's room. He thought that the mob was there to arrest Thomas, and James Sr. shouted, "What do you have against now?" Everything went into chaos. The entire family is awake now. Johanna and Bridget came out to see what was going on. I'm assuming that's what happened. Again, every single source has something different to say, but essentially when I read them all, I didn't understand how Johanna and Bridget were at the scene. So I'm assuming they woke up at some point, came out to see what was happening. But the vigilance committee, they kind of like broke out into different directions to attack the family. Okay, this part is a little bit graphic, but Thomas tried to escape through the front door. I'm not sure like if he was handcuffed to the bed at this point. Again, sources different, or if he was like handcuffed to the front or what. But when he got to the front of the door, he was stabbed with a pitchfork and beaten with a shovel. Some sources say that he was actually caught, and because they felt bad for him because he was just a little kid, they took the handcuffs off before beating him alive. I don't know if that makes a difference. James Sr. and Johanna were both beaten and trampled. Bridget tried to escape. Bridget is the niece, so she was just here to visit and had nothing to do with the violence.
What a time to visit.
Yeah, had nothing to do with the violence or the conflict that was happening in the community. So Bridget tried to run up the stairs and hide, but she was eventually just followed and killed as well. The mob lit the house on fire. However, Johnny the farmhand would eventually escape and later testify in court. He was one of the eyewitnesses, so he got away.
Oh, okay.
While this happened, part of the vigilance committee went to William's house, which was 3 kilometers away from the Donnelly house, and they banged on the door for William. However, it was John who opened the door, and the vigilance committee basically thought he was William and fired shots at John. The men left thinking that they shot William, but it was John who was killed, and William did also witness a couple of the men that were part of this shooting. Okay, any thoughts?
A few. Okay, so first of all, he puts Johnny in his master bedroom, which is kind of strange that he gave that up to this guy, even if the relationship was good. That's weird. When you started, I was like, wait, is he setting him up? But I guess not, because, Johnny's the one who actually got away.
I'm also wondering, because Bridget was over, if the idea was to keep Bridget and Johanna together in one bedroom. And I'm also wondering if, because there was essentially a guest, let's say if he was a friend of Tom, then he essentially was a guest in the house, so they gave him the nicer bedroom, and since he couldn't be in the bedroom with his wife, he just went and slept in his son's bedroom.
Yeah, okay.
None of that matters, because everybody was in the same place and died, other than the boy.
Yeah, so then the fact that they went to William's house and they were gunning for him, thinking, they shot William, this sounds like it may have been more of a business thing, because William is the one who started that coach business.
It was a business. Part of the enemy group of the people in this committee were business rivals in general, people that hated the Donnelly family. So it's like a mix of everything.
Yeah.
They just wanted this family to be gone.
All right, well, that's pretty cut and dry, I guess. And then they burnt down the home. But like, did they not expect that the other Donnelly siblings would like retaliate? Also, Jane is the youngest. She wasn't in the house?
She wasn't in the house, and some sources say that a lot of the Donnelly children weren't in the house. I don't know how old she would have been at this point.
Well, she is 1857 to now 1880, so that 23. She would have been 23 during this.
She was married early, so she could have been married.
Oh, right. She would have already moved
Yeah,
out.
she would have moved out. And I'm assuming a lot of the children at this point were moved out.
Okay, right.
Okay, so the trial. The trial was
hmm
probably the biggest, actually, mistrial I have ever heard of in my life.
Oh,
So remember, this group, this
uh-huh,
community is a tight knit group. Everybody knows each
uh-huh.
other and everybody hates each other. So
Well, it seems like they only hate one person.
pretty much. After this event happened, the local coroner immediately gathered a jury. Remember, the jury also included people that generally hated the Donnellys as well. I'll come back to that. So, local justice officials, if you can even call
hmm
them that, they arrested 13 men. I don't know if the priest got arrested, but the constable James Correll, who put the handcuffs on Thomas, he was arrested. And then there's also reports saying over 30 men got arrested, but I don't have their names. I also should know that this information of the trial is actually from the website citizens.on.ca, and I pretty much copied and pasted word for word. I just want to put that on record before somebody's like, that's plagiarism, because it is. So there was a preliminary hearing to determine whether there was sufficient merit for a trial and for this to proceed to in front of a judge and jury. Since there was eyewitnesses, the farmhand Johnny, and then there was William, it seemed pretty easy, like it would have been closed. But the thing is, Johnny and his family were being harassed, and then court would later determine that Johnny was too young
hmm
to remember things or determine or like sense things accurately. He was 12 at that time, so the court deemed that he was too young. The Crown prosecutor also asked this trial to be taken to a different county, but that request was denied. This is huge because the trial is being taken place within the community where people hated the Donnellys. And the problem with that is essentially everybody knows each other, so it
hmm
just creates a conflict of interest.
Oh yeah, the jury pool is tainted entirely. Yeah.
Exactly. And in a different jurisdiction, you have a judge that doesn't know the accused or the victims. The jury doesn't know who they are. And maybe the lawyer who would be stepping in not also be close to the situation. So that's a fair trial when you don't have a bias for one group. That request was denied. So that's the first red flag to me.
hmm
Okay, that request was denied. The trial occurred on October 4th to 9th, 1880, with both Johnny and William testifying. However, the friends and family of the accused created alibis that said that the accused were somewhere else during the killing. So these people were Catholic people, right? The Irish white boys were Catholics. When you testify, you have to take oath or affirm. I don't know if affirming was a thing back then, I assume it was, but you can take an oath on any religious book. I believe they were Irish Catholic. When they were given their religious book, they were given the wrong one.
hmm
So nobody caught that. The people who were testifying, they caught it, but because they were testifying on the wrong religious book, they felt like they didn't have to be truthful.
What do we mean when we say the wrong religious book?
So they were Irish Catholics. I think the book that they got it was still the Bible, but it was a different Bible.
Like a Protestant Bible?
They said they were going to tell the truth, but because it was a Protestant Bible, they didn't feel the need to be truthful.
Yeah.
Technicalities like that do occur a lot. I can tell you that much.
Oh my God. That is like such a dumb technicality.
Friends and families, they were testifying and they were not given the Catholic Bible, so they were saying the wrong things. The jury deliberated and there was a hung jury. It was believed that the jury members may have been paid off beforehand. One One juror also stated that he would have not convicted Constable James Carroll even if he had seen him do the killing himself. James Carroll went to trial a second time in 1881, and the trial was much smaller, and the judge actually steered the trial in a way that Carroll would be acquitted. So again, because the judge had a bias, he was able to do it, which is a very big mistrial, also illegal. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, and the verdict was not guilty. And I had a direct quote. It said, "It should be noted that newspaper reporters covering the trials believed that the Donnelly brothers, William and Patrick's testimony, reporting them as intelligent and well-spoken individuals. They had a hard time believing the family were the ruffians as described by the locals. At the same time, the press described James Carroll and his band as a bunch of envious, dangerous backwoodsmen with a sinister presence."
Yeah, sorry. So the reporters thought Carroll or the Donnelly brothers?
So they said the Donnelly brothers were intelligent, well-spoken individuals.
Okay.
And then James Carroll, basically the vigilantes were a bunch of envious, dangerous woodsmen with sinister presence.
Got it. Okay.
So I can understand your confusion.
All right.
The trial was that the family members were buried in the cemetery in St. Patrick Roman Catholic Church in Lucian. A few years later, a large monument was made by remaining family members with the names of the deceased inscribed, and under it was "Murdered February 4th, 1880. The Donnelly family descendants later claimed the marker as property and later buried in an undisclosed location. It was later replaced with a smaller marker stating only names and dates. They removed the term "murdered." Sadly, much later, family members of the mob who killed the family were buried in the plot next to the Donnellys. That was noted also in that website. So descendants of the mob, even today, that live in the area, and a lot of people do who are descendants, they don't actually like to talk about this incident. However, the people of the town and township consider the incident with the Donnellys to be a part of their heritage or history that cannot be erased, which is why you have the museum and then the brewery that exist today. And then I got really tired because it was 1 a.m. in the morning, and I just copied and pasted the next little bit, and it kind of tells you where all the sons were. So James Donnelly, the oldest son, Jr., was charged with a variety of crimes before he spent time in prison. He passed away in 1877 at the age 35, possibly by a gunshot before the family massacre took place. Okay, so he was essentially dead. I missed that part.
What do you mean essentially?
He was dead. A part of him was dead. He was just a zombie roaming around, you know?
Yeah.
William Donnelly, he escaped death because his brother took the bullet for him.
Okay.
He tirelessly worked to get his family justice, but he later became a constable in Glencoe and died in 1897. Michael Donnelly married and moved to St. Thomas, Ontario. He took a job in Canada Southern Railroad. He actually never knew of the murder. He was killed in a bar fight in 1879, 1 year before the massacre. Patrick Donnelly, it says he seemed to be a good son who never got into much trouble. He moved away to Thorold, Ontario. He became a wagon maker and died there in 1914. Robert Donnelly ended up doing time in a penitentiary. He was later admitted to the London Psychiatric Hospital in 1808 and died there 3 years later. 1911 he died at the psychiatric hospital.
And admitted 1908 then.
Yeah, so 3 years later he died.
Okay, all right, that makes more sense because I have his date of birth as 1853. I was like, oh, what? 1808?
Next century.
Okay.
Donnelly's only daughter, Jane, she had nothing to do with this. She married young and moved to Glencoe, Ontario, where her older brother would become a constable. She had several children and she died in 1916. There's not many information about what happened to Johnny, the boy who witnessed the brutal murder. Understandably, he had a lot of trauma to deal with. because one, he witnessed all this and then nobody believed him. So that's huge.
Hmm.
Okay, so the area around the murder site, and again, this is the direct quote from the website, the area around the murder site in Biddulph Township hasn't changed much since that incident. So the church is still in use.
What happened to the priest?
I have no fucking clue. It doesn't say.
Okay.
I think everybody just lived their life as normal. So there is a newer house on the Donnelly homestead. Until recently, the owner would give tours to curious tourists who wanted to see the spot where the most infamous crime in Canada took place. So where they lived was called the Roman Line. It still looks the same. So you can actually visit it. And that is my presentation.
This is the most infamous murder in Canadian history.
Apparently. Well, okay, so let me say that whenever I searched up Canadian Unsolved Mysteries, it took me to CanadianMysteries.ca and MysteryQuest.ca, and both websites have like the most popular top 10 unsolved mysteries listed, and the Donnelly Massacre was listed in both as unsolved.
I see. It's like a technical unsolved. Like, it is solved. It's entirely solved. It's just unsolved.
Because I think why it's so infamous is because, like, you have eyewitnesses. We all know what happened. We can see it. We agree with it, but it's still unsolved. So I can see that being why it's so infamous. It's legally unsolved.
Thank you for that. It was thoroughly researched and carried through the timeline really well. I feel like that whole thing with the committee was like some weird power grab that just did not end up working out, and then everybody just wanted to like forget that that happened. There's a concept a friend of ours brought up recently. We were talking to them, and it was the idea of having a negative lightning rod. So one person, there are lots of cases where in a group you have one person who like all your negativity is drawn towards, that allows for everybody else to be cohesive, and it's toxic. It's not something you really should be doing, obviously, but you can have the same thing with like small town communities. That's why you always have to be careful and aware of like who you're interacting with and what kind of relationship you have with the people around you, your neighbors, your family, and all that stuff, because you might end up finding your family as that lightning rod. Everyone thinking that, oh, our community would be better, everybody would be happier if only we did not have these people here. And with everything that happened with our guy James Sr. with that land, and you know, after the whole dispute in court, people probably did start thinking that he was just in general a thief, like that he'd come and like stolen land and whatever. And then that paired with like maybe people being jealous of how well the family was doing, you know, you have a lot of hate directed into one place. So without the father there for those 7 years when he was off in prison or whatever, and just considering the time, you know, the boys obviously felt like, hey, like we gotta step up and protect this land. That leads to, you know, them having to be violent a lot of the time, and that just becomes part and package of like the family and just like the situation. So I don't know why this is still listed as unsolved as far as I'm concerned. This is pretty much solved, you know, we know who did it. But I really think that the idea was just like, if we run them out, our community will be fine and dandy and we will be happy, and that's not how that works. You always find somebody new to blame.
Yeah, and I've thought about that too. It's like, well, one, none of these people that were part of there are alive. And if legally in that time you couldn't take a 12-year-old's statement and use it in court, you can't bring him back. You can't have that trial happen again.
Yeah.
But if we are now to being like, you know what, we know who murdered it, well, we have descendants of those people who are not going to be happy. They still have to live with the fact, because there's a museum, because there's historical like markers everywhere that says like, hey, we know, like even us saying like we know who killed them, they still have to go through some form of shame and trauma. And to come out through the justice ministry and to confirm that and say like, hey, your grandfather did this, your great grandfather did this, is to actually push them into more trauma.
I'm not necessarily saying that like the whole sins of the father, sins of the son situation, like you go after the descendants, but I just feel like it should be a bit of a case closed.
So before we leave, I said that I went on a website called the aaronheller.com. It's an article from February 5th, 2005, which gives Donnelly families an update on them. So the magic of the universe, I guess. So Donnelly's, their house went up in flames. So this man, his name is Mr. Egan, I believe. He was a descendant of James Donnelly, the great great grandson of James Donnelly. He had a lot of the memorabilias, or you can say like things that tied him back to the Donnelly family. So letters, pictures, whatnot. However, I think it was 2001, his house actually also went up in flames on Christmas, and it destroyed anything that would tie him back to the Donnelly family. That was a update.
Oh, Jesus. I'd be curious to know what happened in the town towards the 1960s, because there was another dispute, I think, in Ireland, a really heavy one between Catholics and Protestants, and I wonder if that at that time also ended up bleeding over to the city, and if it brought up some stuff from this specific situation.
Perhaps. I can also imagine maybe there was like a greater immigration too.
Greater immigration?
I wonder if like more people moved into Canada during that time from Ireland, which also caused more conflict because again, conflict doesn't stay in one place with people, it also travels. We already know this community is violent, so but the theories that were made by historians, there's lots. Obviously it doesn't stop with religion and land. There's obviously political dispute for sure, but they narrowed it down to religion being huge and also
That's true.
the land disputes being huge. Undoubtedly, politics is also huge, and it would probably cause a lot of dispute. It even does today.
Let's say hypothetically, it wasn't the committee. Who do you think else might, like a serial killer maybe, who just has remained unnamed since?
Yeah, like a passerby or serial killer types. I was thinking, like, would this case, because it's infamous, and it's probably infamous because it's like there's so much history, there's so much of the past tied into this that led to the massacre. What if it wasn't a serial killer? Would it still be the most infamous unsolved crime?
If this was a serial killer?
Yeah.
Oh, hell yeah.
You think so?
Maybe even more so, because for the last however many years,
Yeah.
we've had like one set of suspects, and there's so much damning evidence on them. So whoever it was managed to get away with it and then put somebody else under the blame, but then the cover up wouldn't really make much sense.
Yeah, like, well, let's for a second say there was no eyewitness, but I'm just wondering how this vigilant committee would react. So imagine if the vigilant committee walked into the house and already found these people dead.
I guess. Or if they walked into like the main home and it was like, oh, hey guys, well, everyone's gonna think it's us, so let's just burn it down.
It's kind of like that part. It's like, how would they react? Would they be like, oh, so our job is done for us, goodbye? It is historical. It is what it is because there's all this information, but what if none of that was there? That was just a thought that came up at some point. It obviously work on these very late. Thank you for listening. This one was a weird one. And I think I went down an entire rabbit hole because I was like, why is this unsolved?
Yeah, that's actually the biggest question for this whole thing. Why is this unsolved? Like, you could technically argue that just like how everything back then seems to imply that there was a bias against the Donnelly family, the legal system and everything was biased against them. The websites and the information that we have today is biased in the opposite direction. You could argue that. Now, biased because it's true or just because it's biased? Like, I'm not going to say obviously, I'll say allegedly, but for me, it's true. We know who did it. But it would be interesting to see if there was anyone who argued something else and what kind of evidence they would have for that.
Yeah, and I haven't found anything. I think because you have these historical markers like museum and stuff like that, it's kind of straightforward. And maybe somewhere along down the line, somebody, probably like family member of the vigilant committee, maybe came out and said like, yeah, it is. We know this definitely did happen. So which is why it doesn't leave room for other theories. I'm thinking that is also why, if we think logically,
Mm-hmm.
what this case study is what happened. But part of it being unsolved is like, why is it unsolved? Like, we have the information. And it goes back to like what I said about what we agreed to is like the trauma and putting people through all that. Essentially, you don't know. It might just bring out more conflict, more hatred between people that is necessarily not
Yeah.
needed. But thank you for listening, Raf. I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, I did. It was a pretty good timeline build. I've already stated where I stand on this. Anyone listening, if you have any commentary, separate opinions, stuff that fill in the gaps, let us know. We are down to get more context always.
So you're on next time we sit together and talk about a case. Do you want to give us any hints?
Yeah, so my next one will be about Valentine's Day
That's exciting.
and murder. Yeah, and some gangster activity. And yeah, okay, that's it. That's all I'll say.
I'm excited. Thanks to everybody who tuned in to this episode. Again, be sure to check us out on all of our platforms. Now we are expanding into Amazon Podcast, or if you're listening on Amazon, go check us out on Spotify. And follow us on Instagram for just general updates or fun things that we do outside of recording. And until then, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day and see you all next time.
Alrighty, bye.
Bye.